have a guest today, and please subscribe, share so that there is a broader audience for UMD Media. UMD Media focus on understanding, measuring, and doing, and it focuses on Ethiopia. And today's session is on Tigray as a lesson, but with a broader picture of Quo Vadis, Ethiopia. My guest today is Dr. Patrick White. Dr. Patrick White, welcome to UMD Media.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Patrick White is a political scientist. He did his PhD on liberal institutionalism in South Sudan, explaining the inability to build lasting peace and an empirical state. So this is a relevant subject matter for looking at Quo Vadis, Ethiopia. So, Dr. Patrick, before dwelling into your PhD thesis, to your dissertation and how it relates to Ethiopia or the Horn, can you tell us your first connection and how you ended up doing this PhD thesis on South Sudan?
Yeah, so I initially ended up in Ethiopia because I had chosen to do my PhD dissertation on South Sudan, and I was wanting to look at the process of state building in South Sudan. But before I was able to actually go to South Sudan to do my research, conflict broke out there. And so then I had to sort of reformulate my research plan. And my sort of, the thing I came upon was that I was going to do a regional approach. So instead of actually having most of my research done in South Sudan, I would go where the mediation was being conducted, which was in Addis Ababa. So the first time that I arrived in Ethiopia was actually in August 2014. And the mediation was sort of just getting underway at that point. And then a few months later, it moved to Bahir Dar for one round for 2 weeks. So I went up to Bahir Dar and then did a sort of tour of the northern parts of Ethiopia. And I ended up spending 9 months on the sidelines of the South Sudan peace process during that research trip. And then I ended up returning twice more in 2016 and 2018, 2019. But essentially, what brought me to Ethiopia was my research on South Sudan, and the fact that South Sudan was so unstable that every time I tried to actually go into South Sudan, the sort of situation, the security situation devolved. So I ended up doing most of my research from Ethiopia.
Okay, great. That given that you were in Ethiopia 2014, beginning 2014, and then you went a couple of times after that. So I can imagine how the dynamics, the climate, the political climate in Ethiopia has been evolving during that period. Can you just highlight on what you observed, what you felt, what you saw during these 3 trips to Ethiopia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely each time I go, I see a sort of new political climate in Ethiopia, and it's one of the things I've really noticed. So when I first arrived in August 2014, politics was sort of hush-hush. People didn't talk about it much. I was sort of the guy often who was bringing the subject up, and in a way that maybe I was breaking some cultural norms at times, right? And I could sense that it wasn't a subject that was spoken a lot about. And then I remember, then I returned in 2016 for 6 months, and everyone was speaking about politics. It was, in the local grocery where people are drinking and having their beers and stuff. Everyone was sort of talking about politics. The conversation was very lively at that point. And it was obviously people were sort of unhappy with everything that was happening with the government, and they were starting to voice that. And this was at the time when you had the state of emergency that was declared. And so at that time, there was a lot of unrest and people were protesting. People were unhappy with the ruling party. And then the third time when I went, I returned in 2018, 2019. This was when Abiy was in power. And at that time, the sense that I got in Addis was that sort of being Tigrayan, or the word Tigray, was sort of had very negative connotations. And if I even mentioned it, people were sort of caught off guard in a way that I hadn't experienced in the past before. So I thought that was a really a telling change in the environment. And I noticed that. But at that time, I was very supportive of Abiy, to be quite honest with you. And it was only in time after that that I started sort of becoming more and more disenchanted. But certainly each time I've been to Ethiopia, it's you've seen a major evolution, obviously, like economically in terms of the development of the country, but also politically. I was entering a whole new environment every time that I returned to Ethiopia.
Talking about supporting Abiy at the initial period, I think that was kind of universal in Ethiopia. I would say from Mekelle to Adama to Bahar Dar. In fact, I do remember that when it's not usual to do polls, public polls and so on, but at that time there was a journalist or a newspaper that did that kind of poll. So the approval rate actually was higher in Mekelle than even Adama and so on. It's against what one would expect. Then, of course, that deteriorated, and during fast forward to November 2020, we saw the war started, right? Talking about the war, I would like to show our viewers today, as we are doing this program, it's day 124, so 124th day today, this war on Tigray, and I'm showing this 4.5 million people affected in terms of needing emergency food. We have official figures saying that over 61,700 people seeking refuge in Sudan, out of which 31% are children. We have seen all kinds of social services cut, blocked, closed, from electricity to communication to banks and so on. So this war is something that will be coming back and forth in terms of your expertise in the region, in terms of how it relates, or if there is anything that we can take from your dissertation in the way forward. But let's talk about your work. Focusing on South Sudan, you did your PhD thesis. By the way, congratulations, because this is a freshly minted, hot from the oven, so to speak. And I would like to congratulate you on your PhD.
Thank you very much.
So take us into the core of your thesis or dissertation. What question were you trying to answer?
Essentially, there's two main questions that I was trying to answer in my dissertation. The first one was to explain, why has conflict been so persistent in South Sudan, and why has it been so difficult to build state institutions in South Sudan? And the second related question then is, well, what should be done? And in the context of South Sudan, because there was so much intervention, when we're talking about what should be done, often we're talking about what should the international community do. But my main thesis is looking at more internal processes, and how democratization and state formation are internal processes that involve clashes among various forces in society. Sometimes violent, sometimes we're talking patron-client bargaining, but essentially when we're talking about forming a state, that's sort of the main basis for it, is generally through those types of relationships. And in terms of South Sudan, I was asking the question, well, why has the state been so weak? Why does the state weakness persist? Why is it been so difficult for the international community to come in and transport democracy and build liberal state institutions, which has been their mission since signing the CPA in 2005. And sort of my answer that I came to, a lot of scholars, John Young and others, they really point to the failures of the mediators. They'll say the mediators should have had a more liberal approach. They should have been more inclusive. They should have been more interventionist from a liberal perspective. And my thesis really looks at things more from a realist perspective in terms of criticizing like what realistically the international community can achieve in terms of building institutions and transporting democracy, but also questioning whether it's right just in a sort of in a sort of moral sense that we should be trying to transport Western institutions in an African context and looking at more how institutions develop organically and internally, and they need to be representative of the society that they're meant to govern, right? So a lot of my thesis is looking at how, like the reasons why in South Sudan you haven't seen this transformation, where in some places like Somaliland, conflict has been used to build a sort of strong state institutions. Like a rebel group was able to transform its experience of warfare into a strong state. But in South Sudan, why was that not the case? So a lot of the questions I was trying to answer was like, why has it been so difficult to build a state in South Sudan? And then the second question was, then what should we do about it? Which is something that we could get more in depth into.
Interesting. So I think the idea of state and state formation and talking about the nature of state are the critical factor. I think that would give us an opportunity, I guess, to converse about Ethiopia, right? So
Yeah.
to talk about that, in terms of the states, the nature of the state and the formation, and maybe also related to how the political agents interact, with each other, and then when you try to bring an external model or institutional setup, how that also leads to further conflict or not, getting the type of integration that one would hope, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of like when we're talking about the nature of the state, like what exactly am I referring to? Often what we're talking about is how the states were formed. So every state has its particular experience, and they're always formed through warfare. Like in Canada, you have layers of peoples. You had indigenous peoples, and then you had the French, the English, and then immigrant populations. And the state was forged through violence, through conquest, and that was the case everywhere. But the argument is that in Africa, there was a very specific experience of state formation, where you had the colonial experience had taken place in other regions in Latin America, but it happened very late in Africa, and it happened in a very particularly brutal fashion, but also in a way in which the states were drawn. A lot of my focus is on the borders and how borders drive conflict. And so the colonial experience, you had these borders which were drawn, and in the post-colonial period, there was a decision that the borders would stay the same. But so then you had post-colonial African rulers struggling to project their power over the entirety of these territories that they didn't really control. And often what you'd see is a disconnect between the capital and then the periphery. And you also saw a constant struggle between the central state power and the periphery. The central state trying to exert its power, and that leading to conflict, and the regions trying to exert their autonomy, which also leads to conflict. So you see that happening in South Sudan, but South Sudan has a very particular experience where it was very underdeveloped. During the colonial period, the British kept it separate from the North for various reasons. And then after that, in the post-colonial period, Khartoum kept the South very underdeveloped economically, politically, And so a lot of the reasons why it's so difficult in South Sudan to build institutions, I argue, is not that the international community doesn't have the right approach or the right strategy necessarily. It's that the history of state formation has been so difficult in South Sudan that that it's you can't really move forward. Whereas in Ethiopia, you had a very different experience of state formation, which we can get into. But how Ethiopia, I mean, at least officially, was the only country that was never colonized. So when we're talking about artificial borders in Ethiopia, it interacts very differently. Although my argument is that you had both a process of pushing away European colonization, but also of internal colonization within Ethiopia, that is the driving factor behind a lot of the conflicts that you see, where some of the regions that in the late 19th century, from the time of Menelik on, that were incorporated into what is now Ethiopia, it was done by force, and a lot of those peoples didn't necessarily see themselves always as being Ethiopian. And there's this constant struggle between people that see themselves through more of an ethno-nationalist lens in Ethiopia and those that see Ethiopia as one country and are Ethiopian nationalists and want the central state to sort of exert its power over the entire territory, and those who really look to more regional identities and want the regions to have their autonomy. So when we're talking about how the nature of the state in Ethiopia drives conflict, we're often talking about this: how was the state formed, and how does this struggle between the central state and the various regions, how does that make it so that conflict seems perpetual in Ethiopia? It seems that there is no way to sort of escape conflict, and a lot of that, I argue, comes along with just the way the state was formed and its borders and how those sort of drive conflict.
Interesting, yeah. You talked about in your dissertation as well this perpetuation of conflict and where, to what is the entry point for that vicious circle, so to speak. So understanding the basic theme of this media as well. So within the Ethiopian context and zooming in into the Tigray issue, the idea of having this conversation is as well to add into the understanding of the causes and the dynamics. Talking about colonialization, so you just a couple of days ago, you tweeted on how Ethiopia is an interesting case study in the use of the language of decoloniality, to deny what's going on in Tigray in terms of war crime and crimes against humanity. I think this is a good entry point. If you comment on that, and then we can talk a bit about Tigray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, in my dissertation, I'm obviously arguing against intervention and against outside powers imposing political structures and defining what the political structure of a country should be. So in South Sudan, I sort of argued against the institution building, the liberal institution building project, against the sort of democracy promotion project in many ways. But when I say that, I don't mean, and I'm very clear in my dissertation when I talk about the solutions, that I'm very in favor of humanitarianism and even the international community putting pressure on regimes that are committing war crimes and abusing human rights. So in my dissertation, I keep those things very separate: the idea of institution building and democracy promotion, and of human rights and humanitarianism, and the international community making an effort to make a world where war crimes don't take place. So what we're seeing in Ethiopia today is that people are taking the language of decoloniality and saying that any organization that talks about human rights or about war crimes that are taking place in Tigray, they're just Western imperialists who are I assume some people say that they're making up the human rights or abuses, or that they're exaggerating them or manipulating them, that they see everything from a one-sided perspective. But the end result of what you get is this this sort of language of anti-colonialism that's used in the service of repressing people within the country domestically. So you've seen it historically in Ethiopia, where Menelik pushed out the Italians at Adwa and then sold off Eritrea, right? But then used those guns to conquer the southern territories. So there's a sort of connection between this use of resisting European colonialism as a way to justify internal colonialism in Ethiopia. And you're really seeing this rear its head in Tigray, where anyone who talks about human rights abuses or war crimes is getting, well, if you're a foreigner, you get called either a TPLFite, or they will say that that you're just a Western imperialist who's trying to impose his view of politics on Ethiopia, or you're violating Ethiopia's sovereignty. So I just find that sort of argument really problematic, and a sort of perversion of the sort of arguments that I'm making, where I'm saying we shouldn't be imposing our political structures on Africa. We shouldn't be forcing it into a very specific model of democracy. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we take this completely cultural relativist argument, or like an argument, a realist argument of state sovereignty to the extreme, where even voicing our concerns about what we're witnessing in Tigray is then framed as like Western colonizers imposing their view of African politics. So I just sort of have been pushing back against that sort of notion. And you see it in Eritrea as well, that some regime supporters, PFDJ supporters, will do that as well, where they wrap themselves in sort of the language of decoloniality, when really what they're doing is saying, don't criticize Isaias. And so in doing that, the internal opposition in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, gets sort of silenced as well.
Yeah, I see your point. I mean, either people are labeled as paid, or agents, all that and so on. So that's kind of known strategy of silencing dissent or opposition or debate. So talking about Tigray, the war on Tigray, did you see this coming? Because I just want to share this screen on an article you wrote in 2020. I don't know exact months of you writing, but this is on threats to Ethiopia's fragile democratic transition, where you outlined the different incidents in Amhara, in Oromia, all that, and you kind of give a very good overview of the outline and the details and so on. So just the question is, did you see this coming, and the scale and the everything that's happening? Was it on the radar, can we say? Can you just walk us through what was coming, given that 6 years before that was your first arrival in Ethiopia, and then you went twice, and you painted for us the climate, how it was changed, the political climate, I mean. So just in the writing of this article, before or after that, what was for you the months going to the war?
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you, in terms of the scale of the war, I'll tell you straight up that I did not see that coming. The brutality of the war, I maybe should have seen it, but I really didn't. In terms of did I see a conflict approaching, in that article, which was written in around September 2020, I felt like it was one of the hot regions, but honestly, I didn't even put it first in my article, because I felt like Oromia at that time, because it was right after the Hachalu Hundessa assassination, and I felt like Oromia was the hot region at that time. But you saw all of these signs in Tigray that were making me nervous. I mean, you saw both governments essentially declaring that they didn't recognize the constitutional authority of the other. You saw both sides beefing up their security forces. You saw 2 years of Abiy sort of targeting members from the TPLF party exclusively, and them not joining his Prosperity Party, and then sort of maybe working against his reform agenda for 2 years. So you saw a lot of signs of a sort of conflict between the two, that it was sort of inevitable to a certain extent. And what I should have seen that maybe I didn't recognize naively was that when you started seeing Abiy and Isaias having these meetings going back to like 2018, at that moment I should have had alarm bells ringing, because when you see that alliance presented as a peace deal, and Abiy being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, there was a lot of people that were sort of sucked into that, but in the end, I think it was more a personal enmity pact. And what you're seeing now is an alliance between Abiy, Isaias, and elites within the Amhara region who are essentially trying to destroy Tigray. And so, I mean, I certainly didn't see that coming, that we would have essentially a war of extermination, which is kind of how I see this conflict.
Yeah, I think that this has been very difficult to predict, so to speak, in terms of the brutality, the atrocities, the scale, and the surrounding Tigray. Not only in terms of the warfare and so on, but in terms of the psychological and physical infrastructure set up for closing up on Tigray, in terms of the information blackout, the communication blackout, destroying everything. So I mean, I don't take it as easy subject to predict even months before the war. I hear that clearly. And then the war started on November 4th. We are not going to go to the details of how it started and what the narratives are surrounding that. But on December 2nd, you wrote another article that is on Ethiopia's civil war, competing visions on the nature of the state. I think that even from the title, it kind of merits some discussion on that. So just when you talk about competing visions, what are we talking about in that? And then, you can talk about the content of the article as well. This is almost 1 month after the start of the war.
Yeah, I mean, so to put it simply to start, I mean, when we're talking about competing visions, we're talking about unitarists and federalists, right? So unitarists basically see Ethiopia as one. They present it as a very sort of nationalistic sort of view of Ethiopia. The Battle of Adwa is sort of like the crowning achievement in this sort of narrative of Ethiopian history. But then there's people who view Ethiopian history from a more regional perspective. And their argument is that sort of the grand narratives of Ethiopian history is sort of a celebration of empire, in a way that if you really look at things from a class perspective, and you think about the different groups of people who were subjugated, or the types of brutal battles that led to the creation of the Ethiopian state, and the power structures that entailed when it comes to land, when it comes to language, and the people's instruction, and the various the administration. All of these things were sort of imposed on various groups of people historically in Ethiopia, specifically the southern regions, but you also had a historical battle between Tigray and Showa. And in that battle, I mean, you also had Tigray, which was described historically as sort of a junior partner of the Shoan kings and the Shoan elite, But you also had various periods in history where Tigray was trying to exert its autonomy. The 1943 Wayane against Haile Selassie. Also in the 80s, you had the rebellions against Mengistu and the Derg regime. So there's a very long history throughout Ethiopia's various regions of different groups trying to exert their autonomy. And every time they do, they get kind of branded or labeled as ethno-nationalists. Whereas I don't think ethno-nationalism is an inherently negative thing. Sometimes it makes sense when you have a genocidal state trying to exterminate you solely based on your ethnicity. It makes a lot of sense to regroup around that ethnicity. It's like calling Black nationalism in the United States divisive. But that's what you see in Ethiopia a lot of times, is the people who see Ethiopia as a singular concept. Anyone who tries to talk about things like language or regional autonomy or self-administration, anytime they talk about that, they get labeled divisive, and it's a problem. And so I see the conflict in Tigray as an extension of this, even though, of course, the TPLF and by extension, to some extent, the Tigray people were in power for 27 years. What you're seeing now since 2018 is that they've become a regional power, and it's the central state that's trying to exert itself over Tigray. And I think a lot of this war is about exerting central power. And for that reason, I feel like to a certain extent, Tigray may be stage one in a battle that has more stages, and the next hot region is obviously Oromia in terms of what we're witnessing, in terms of the state trying to impose its will on the regions.
That's a very good overview on what's underneath of all this war and so on. So these competing visions. So when I compare Canada with what's happening in Ethiopia, so for Canada in terms of self rule and the shared rule at the federal level is it's not perfect, but it has its own institutional backup, and we know how things work. And you are in Quebec as we do this conversation. So if you look at what's happening in Tigray now, specifically for me, the most unexpected element in all this is how the Ethiopian diaspora and the opposition parties, everything, these elements are surrounding this war, that's domestically, unexpected, because normally what we saw in the last 27 years before Abiy and even before that, normally the diaspora would be always opposing the government, which would make sense because government has a power and you have to challenge that power or question it at least, right? That's not happening right now. So there seems to be, this is not scientific, but there seems to be a very everyone coming together against Tigray. But beyond the domestic elements, if you look at the regional element as well, we have Eritrea, Isaias, and then we don't have confirmed, reports and investigation done, but there are other elements as well from Middle East to that region and so on. So in one part in your thesis, you mention here, I quote, where ruling elites get their money from and who they depend on to sustain it, or therefore shapes the nature of state-making project you mentioned. So I'm interested in the money element or the financial element or anything, broader, external factors. So do you see the focus and the war on Tigray? Why are, regional powers or elements interested in this? I just want to look at from your thesis perspective, if there are any lessons or elements that we can borrow from your thesis to apply to Ethiopia and specifically to Tigray.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the regional elements and the economic factors of how they intertwine, I mean, one of the biggest factors is obviously the GERD, the dam being built up in the Nile, and that has drawn Egypt into the conflict. And Sudan is obviously now engaged in a conflict with Ethiopia over the Fashka Triangle, and that's a land dispute. Um, Other powers, I mean, you had the UAE that was involved, and they've since left their base in Assad, but they were launching, I mean, reportedly launching drone strikes from there. And a lot of that had to do with the regional factors. Obviously, they were using that base as part of their war in Yemen. And so they also made a deal, I assume, with Isaias to then join into the war in Ethiopia. Other countries like the United States is harder to read. Under the Trump administration, you had this funny double game where Trump was both threatening to blow up the GERD on the side of Egypt, but then also on the Tigray conflict was completely taking the side of the Abiy regime and just basically echoing their talking points. Now with the incoming Biden administration, you're seeing more pressure put on the Abiy regime and Isaias to de-escalate and to allow humanitarian access in, to allow investigations. But it's really difficult to sort of unpack the driving factors behind the Biden administration's policy, because you're kind of seeing them try to play ball a little bit with Abiy, but also criticizing the Abiy regime. So in terms of the external factors, every country sort of has their interests. And in my thesis, I really took a more realist perspective. And when we're talking about like realist theory, we're talking about viewing the world through the perspective of power and interests, and that states, when they move and when they act, it's never about consensus building and sort of working together in a way that liberal scholars tend to view it. That when they act in a region and how they act, it always has to do at the end of the day with exerting their own power and pursuing their economic and geopolitical interests in a country. So if you want to see how any of these external forces are acting, you generally just have to investigate their interests. And oftentimes when push comes to shove, it's not humanitarian objectives that are the driving force. I mean, if you look at what happened in Rwanda, that was a case where, as anti-interventionist as you can be, most people would say the international community should have intervened in Rwanda, but there weren't these sort of economic and geopolitical driving forces. And so there was not only not an intervention, but you had the United States trying to prevent other countries from intervening, and the French intervening on the side of the Hutu for most of the genocide. So if we're looking at Tigray, oftentimes, like, if we want to understand like why a certain country is acting in the way it is in relation to Tigray and Ethiopia, you just have to understand their economic interests. And when it comes to Egypt, it's very clearly that it's the dam, and for Sudan, it's the border dispute. But that's all gotten tied in with the dam dispute with Egypt. So if you want, yeah.
Well, maybe where is South Sudan right now, given the Ethiopian, Eritrean, Isaias, and Tigray? Because reportedly, Isaias and Abiy went to Juba yesterday, and the Al-Sisi went to Khartoum. So where do you see these actors play in terms of the war on Tigray?
Yeah, it's really interesting South Sudan's place in this conflict, because initially all of the sort of little scuttlebutts that we're getting was that like South Sudan was on the side of Sudan and Egypt. There was talk that even that Debretsion had gone to Juba and had met with Al-Sisi in Juba, and then there was denials of that report. But then so So it's not even clear if that meeting ever really happened. But there was a certain period of time when we were getting a lot of unnamed reports that seemed to indicate that South Sudan was joining that alliance. And then now we saw this week that President Kiir was meeting with Isaias and Abiy at the same time that Egypt and Sudan are signing a military pact and meeting with each other. So I don't really know what that indicates. Like, it might not necessarily indicate that South Sudan is on the side of Abiy and Isaias. It could indicate that Salva Kiir is trying to play peacemaker in the region, but that might be a little bit optimistic of a view. But to be quite honest with you right now, in terms of where South Sudan stands, that's actually probably one of the toughest countries to sort of pinpoint what their interests are and where they stand in the country. I feel like they might be sort of a swing state, and to use a sort of American political terminology, but that South Sudan could end up going either way, whereas other countries are already kind of set in their position.
Yeah, I think it's very fluid, and as we speak, it might change this way or the other. So we will follow on that. So maybe on the international arena. So where do you see, or what? How do you assess, the reaction of the European Union from the beginning compared to the US, even closer to home, Canada? Where are we in terms of the landscape of reaction to the war on Tigray?
I mean, to be honest, it's been somewhat muted on all fronts. Like, if we're going to talk about Canada, I saw that Justin Trudeau had a meeting with Abiy, and it was pretty tepid criticism where he hardly even mentioned Tigray. So I have to say I was quite disappointed with my own prime minister. The European Union suspended aid to Ethiopia directly as a result of the Tigray conflict. The United States had previously suspended aid, but that was what Trump did based on the GERD dispute. And so now the Biden administration has delinked the GERD dispute with the rescinding of aid. So now it's more tied to the Tigray conflict. So that is one of the mechanisms that you're seeing that of actual action, is the sort of withholding of aid. In terms of other concrete sort of actions, we've seen very little, but part of that is that it's so difficult to get any credible information that we've only started to see the reports of the crimes seeping out, and that part of the really nefarious thing about this war is how it's being conducted under the cover of dark, and that makes it difficult for international organizations to substantiate any of the claims and then to justify acting on any of them. And then you also have to think that some of these countries, if they start really calling a spade in terms of what exactly is happening here, do they really want to intervene? And what would an intervention look like? What exactly would it entail? So some countries don't want to get dragged in, so they don't necessarily want to say exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
But if they use certain words, then there's the responsibility to protect that could be invoked, and they would be legally obligated to intervene.
Yeah, that's what we saw last week in the UN Security Council as well, right? So many were expecting in terms of what the African nations in the UN Council, Security Council would do, but all three countries were siding with the US, the UK, France in terms of calling a spade a spade. So, but then we have China and Russia and India as well opposing for a collective statement from the council. So, I mean, it has been difficult to, foresee this war in advance. And it might not be easy to foresee again how it will end. But what is your assessment how this will play out in the coming weeks and months, given what we are seeing domestically and maybe regionally as well?
Well, I would say we're definitely seeing a shift in the power balance, and we've seen it in the last couple of weeks, where at the beginning of the war, sort of I mean, the TPLF's forces were decimated. And I think the main factors that a lot of analysts have identified to explain that is the drone strikes, presumably the UAE, and also the fact that he was able to get Eritrea to involve so forcefully, and the Amhara regional forces to be involved so forcefully on Abiy's side. But since then, you've seen a sort of gradual shift where, with the UAE pulling out, and then the conflict between Abiy and Sudan, it's really pushed Sudan into the camp of at least being against the Abiy regime, which we don't know to what extent Sudan and Egypt might be helping, the TPLF or the TDF. But certainly they're against the Abiy regime now, and it wasn't clear at the beginning of the war what side Sudan would be on. So we're seeing in recent weeks sort of, it feels like a shift in the power balance, also with the changing U.S. administration and putting pressure for Eritrea to leave, for humanitarian access to be opened up. You're really seeing that the international environment is much less friendly for Abiy right now. And internally, there's some factors also that should give Abiy pause for concern in Oromia, Benishangul Gumuz, other areas where you're seeing a lot of opposition, and at a certain point, Abiy isn't going to be able to be fighting wars on all fronts and have his allies dropping by the wayside. And even when you talk about his main ally, Isaias, the extent to which Isaias is actually Abiy's ally, I think we can really debate. I feel like Isaias is trying to mastermind the region and sort of trying to destabilize Ethiopia. Primarily, he wants to destroy the TPLF, but I feel like part of Isaias's objective is to fight his regional battles in Ethiopia as a means to cause Ethiopia to collapse as an entity, so that he can then be the regional kingmaker. So really right now, the one force that's keeping Abiy's war alive is Isaias and Eritrea. But if somehow they were ever forced out of this war, which I'm not sure if the United States or any other external power could actually force them to do that, but if they were, then you really have a major shift in the power balance of the war.
Okay, great. I think my last couple of questions would be related to on how you see the international community can and should do. But maybe a segue to that would be on the role of the African Union so far, and countries like Kenya, very close to Ethiopia, but I mean geographically, but I think farther from supporting Abiy as maybe like Somalia did and others, right? So just looking at how you see the African Union has been involved or not involved in this, how do you see the international community beyond African Union as well playing out and in terms of role on this conflict or war?
Well, so far we haven't seen or heard too much from the African Union as an entity. In terms of Kenya specifically, I feel like they're sort of a more neutral party that is looking more for regional peace. Like I don't feel that Kenya has a real dog in the fight. But the African Union so far hasn't really marshaled its strength to really present us any sort of unified front on the Tigray issue. You've seen many different African leaders offer their support as mediator. We saw Museveni in Uganda. We saw the leader of the UAE. We saw many different heads of state who threw in their hat to to be the head of the mediation, but Abiy has rejected all of them. So at the moment, with Abiy sort of rejecting any sort of regional or continental movements towards mediation, it just seems like it's stalled.
Hmm. Hmm. Maybe on the topic of Abiy not, heeding to any calls for mediation and so on, do you see he's in a kind of a difficult position given that he declared on November 28th the war is over? The rest is, just law enforcement operation that could be carried by the police and the prosecutors and so on. Now that we know for fact that the war is not over, is it easy for him, given also Isaias is very involved in this, for Abiy to, see negotiation or dialogue happening? And at the same time, without dialogue, you mentioned about Oromia, Benshangul Gums, and elsewhere, there are a lot of hot spots in Ethiopia.
Yeah, he's put himself in a really difficult position because he basically declared the TPLF a terrorist group and a junta. And so then saying that we're going to negotiate with them on the grounds of like a regular civil war, where we're talking about things like power sharing or like regional autonomy to some extent, or like, even the idea of the TPLF staying within the Ethiopian body politic in any way or form, that seems like a no-go for Abiy. But so then where does that leave us in terms of mediation when Abiy, basically what he's saying is the only thing we're going to accept is the total defeat of the TPLF and the Tigray Defense Forces. But then what does that really entail when you talk about seemingly the majority of people in Tigray support the TPLF and the TDF? So you're talking about violently separating people from the government that they support. So, I mean, we're seeing a lot of sort of the strategies that of repression to try to separate people from their government. But what that entails is it's essentially brutalizing the people to get them to not support their regional government.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy, to articulate in terms of what would play out, given that what he said and what he acted upon are totally against what the reality is in Tigray. So if you think about, when he declared that the war is over, now the people of Tigray are free, you would expect the free people would celebrate that victory.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is the opposite. So, and I think the strategy of dark or information blackout is also part of that strategy, where you would hope, or he would hope, nothing will come out, and everybody will believe that narrative and so on. So thank you very much. I mean, I hope this conversation adds to the discussion, to the dialogue, to the discourse that is very much necessary in Ethiopia and in Tigray and in the Horn of Africa, on understanding what are the factors, who are the players, what are the stakes, in this war on Tigray. And my guest today was Dr. Patrick White. He has a PhD in political science and international development, with a focus on South Sudan, and his PhD thesis was from this year, I would say January 2021. So thank you very much for being my guest today, Dr. White.
Thank you very much, Getachew.
And the conversation will continue. And this was UMD Media on Quo Vadis Ethiopia Part 10. And your host was Getachew Asafa, and we'll continue with another guest, continuing on the same subject of Quo Vadis Ethiopia. ኢትዮጵያ ወዴት? ስጋት፣ እድሎች፣ እንቅፋቶችና አስቻይ ሁኔታዎች። የዛሬው ስርጭት እዚህ ላይ ያበቃል። መልካም ጊዜ።